I invited my son and his fiancée to Christmas dinner. On the day they never showed, they were at her parents' house instead. I found out from a Facebook photo. My name is Roland Fitch. I'm 67 years old, retired carpenter. And 8 months ago, I buried my wife Beverly after 41 years of marriage. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did. I just didn't want to admit it. Not on the first Christmas without her. Beverly passed in April. Quietly, the way she did most things. Good woman. Steady. She used to joke that she kept the whole house running while I just thought I did. She wasn't wrong about that. When December came around, I made a plan. Nothing big. Just a small dinner. My son Everett and his fiancée Lorraine would come over. That was it. I didn't want to sit in that house alone on Christmas for the first time in 4 decades. I cooked for 2 days straight. Beverly's pot roast with the herb crust, the one she made every holiday. Mashed potatoes the way Everett liked them growing up. Extra butter, sour cream stirred in until they were almost smooth. Cornbread from scratch using her recipe card, the one with her handwriting on it and a grease stain on the corner from years of use. Green bean casserole, pecan pie. I got out the good china, the set we only used on Thanksgiving and Christmas. I put Bing Crosby on the old record player. By noon, the house smelled the way it used to. I set the table at noon. By 1 in the afternoon, everything was ready and sitting warm on the stove. At 2:30, I sent Everett a text. Just see you soon. No answer came back. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting by the front window watching the road. By 3:30, the cornbread was getting dry, and I put it back in the oven on low. I turned the music down. Still no call, no message. At 3:45, I heard a knock. I got up thinking they were just running late. When I opened the door, it was a delivery driver in a windbreaker holding a small envelope. He handed it over without making eye contact and walked back to his truck. I stood on the porch in the cold and opened it. Inside was a note in Lorraine's handwriting. Neat and even, the kind of handwriting that takes effort. It said, "Roland, we're so sorry we decided to spend Christmas with my family this year. It was a last-minute change. We hope you understand. Merry Christmas, Lorraine and Everett." No phone call, no real explanation. Sent through a courier so nobody had to look me in the eye. I went back inside and stood in my kitchen. The food was still warm on the stove. 2 empty plates on the table. I poured a glass of sweet tea and sat down at the head of the table and looked at the chair across from me where Beverly used to sit. I tried to eat something. My throat wouldn't cooperate. After a while, I packed everything into containers and put it all in the refrigerator. Everything except the pecan pie. I left that on the counter. I don't know why. I just couldn't put it away yet. The phone never rang. No texts. No Merry Christmas from anyone. Late that evening, I picked up my phone and did something I don't usually do. I went on Facebook. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed somewhere to put my eyes that wasn't the empty room, and there it was. Posted by Lorraine's mother. A long dinner table, full house, wine glasses, candles, everyone dressed up. Everett sitting right next to Lorraine with his arm around her shoulder, laughing at something. Her mother had written the caption, "So grateful for a house full of family this Christmas." I set the phone face down on the coffee table. They didn't forget, they made a choice. That night I sat in the living room with the tree light still on. The chair across from me was the one Beverly used to sit in. She had a particular way of tucking her feet up under her when she watched TV, always with a blanket even in summer. I used to tease her about it. I would give a lot to hear her argue back right now. I thought about Christmases when Everett was small, Beverly in the kitchen starting at dawn, me out on the porch stringing lights in the cold because I always waited until the last minute. Everett tearing into wrapping paper like it had done something to him personally. The 3 of us on the couch at the end of the night, tired and full, watching whatever movie Beverly picked. After Everett got older and started bringing Lorraine around, things shifted. The first Christmas they were together, she said they were going to her parents' place. I understood that. New relationship, her family wanted to see her. The year after it was the same. Then the year after that. They'd show up at our house for an hour or two already full from eating at her mother's, poking at Beverly's food and checking their phones. Lorraine would ask Beverly questions about the house, about what we were planning to do with the extra bedroom, about whether we'd thought about downsizing. Beverly always answered politely, but I noticed she'd get quiet on the drive afterward. Now I sat alone in a house that still smelled like pot roast and nobody was coming. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the tree lights on until almost 2 in the morning, just sitting there in the quiet with Beverly's chair empty across from me. Next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out with the TV on low. The tree lights were still glowing in the living room. I hadn't turned them off. I pulled on my boots and a heavy jacket and went outside. Cold morning, frost on the grass, breath showing in the air. Beverly always said I think better when I move, so I walked. Just around the property at first, then out to the garage. I wasn't looking for anything. I just needed somewhere to go that felt familiar. The garage still had her things on one shelf in the corner, a few gardening books, a tin of dried herbs she'd kept out there for some reason I never figured out, a small wooden box she used to store seed packets in the spring. I'd left everything exactly where she put it. Couldn't bring myself to move any of it. I ran my hand along the underside of the shelf the way I used to when I was checking if I'd built it level. That's when I felt it. An envelope taped flat against the wood, sealed. My name on the front in Beverly's handwriting. The letters were a little shaky, the way they got near the end when her hands were giving her trouble, but still neat, still hers. I peeled it off carefully and stood there under the garage light holding it. Inside was a short note and a USB drive. The note said, "Roland, if you're reading this, you already know something is wrong. Open the USB." The file called "Start Here. I love you." I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. I plugged the drive into my laptop. There was one folder inside it, a file called "Start Here," a second folder called "Notes," and a third one called "For Milton." I opened "Start Here." It was an audio file. Beverly's voice came through the speakers and I had to grip the edge of the table. She sounded calm. She always sounded calm when she had something important to say. She told me she'd been keeping notes for the past several months, that she'd noticed things about Lorraine she didn't like and couldn't stop thinking about. The way Lorraine would steer conversations toward money whenever the three of them were together. The way she'd ask questions about the house that weren't really questions, more like she was taking inventory. The time Lorraine had gone into the study while Beverly was in the kitchen and Beverly had come back to find her standing at Randall's desk looking through papers. When Beverly asked what she was looking for, Lorraine said she was just admiring the room. Beverly said she didn't want to cause problems without something solid. She didn't want to put Everett in the middle or accuse anyone of anything she couldn't back up. But she also wasn't going to leave without making sure I had what I needed if things went the direction she was starting to fear. She said she loved Everett. She said she knew he was a good man at his core. But she also said that a good man can get turned around when he's trying to keep someone else happy. And that she'd watched it happening slowly for 2 years. Her voice stayed steady the whole way through. That was Beverly. Even at the end, even on a recording she made knowing I'd only find it after something had already gone wrong, she stayed steady. At the end of the recording she said, "There's a man named Milton Pressler. His number is in the For Milton folder. Call him. He's been expecting to hear from you. He'll explain the rest." The recording stopped. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The coffee I'd made was cold. Outside the window, the frost was starting to melt off the grass as the sun came up. I opened the notes folder next. Beverly had kept detailed records going back 14 months. Dates, conversations, things she'd observed. Written the way she used to write her lesson plans when she was still teaching, organized by date and subject. She'd noted the time Lorraine mentioned twice in one visit that eventually we'd probably want to move somewhere smaller. She'd written down a conversation where Lorraine had asked Everett within Beverly's earshot whether his father had a will set up and whether it was current. She noted the day she found a piece of scratch paper near the phone with account numbers written on it in handwriting that wasn't mine or hers. Page after page of quiet, careful observations from a woman who saw exactly what was happening and made sure it wouldn't happen without a record. I read every word. Then I opened the For Milton folder. There was a short document. Beverly had written a summary of what she'd observed and what she'd asked Milton Pressler to prepare on my behalf. She'd met with him twice in her last 2 months without telling me. She hadn't told me because she didn't want me to worry while she was still here. She wanted it to be something waiting for me, not something I had to carry with her. At the bottom she'd written, "He has everything set up. All you have to do is call him and tell him what's been happening. He'll take it from there." I closed the laptop. I sat in that kitchen in the quiet for a while, just breathing. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the number. Milton Pressler answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and professional. He said he'd been hoping I would call. We set a meeting for the next afternoon at his office in South Asheville, second floor of an old brick building with a bakery on the ground level. The kind of place you walk past 100 times and never notice. He was older than I expected. Late 60s, trim gray hair, simple glasses. He shook my hand like he meant it and led me into a back room with filing cabinets along every wall and a small table with 2 chairs. He poured coffee without asking if I wanted any and sat down across from me. He said Beverly was one of the most prepared people he had ever worked with. Then he opened a folder and got to it. 5 years ago, he told me, Beverly had quietly moved a significant portion of our retirement savings into a separate trust. In my name only, not listed on any shared portfolio, not visible to anyone who looked at our joint accounts or our general financial records. She had done it carefully and legally, with Milton's help over the course of several months. The trust held $650,000. I stared at the papers he slid across the table. My name printed at the top, no joint holder, no secondary access of any kind. Beverly had called it the just in case account. Milton said those were her exact words. He said she told him, if anything ever happens to me and Everett's relationship with his father goes the direction I'm worried about, I want Roland to have his own footing. I don't want him to have to ask anyone for anything. I sat back in my chair. He wasn't done. He pulled out a second document. 3 months ago, he said, the bank had flagged an address change on one of our joint checking accounts. The new mailing address on record was not our house. It was an apartment on the east side of town. He slid a printed record across the table with the address circled. It was Lorraine's apartment. Someone had changed where our bank statements were being sent without telling me. That meant for 3 months, financial correspondence from that account had been going to Lorraine's address instead of mine. I kept my face still and let him keep going. He pulled out a third document. Everett, he said, had signed a limited access authorization form on that same joint account approximately 4 months ago. The form gave Lorraine the ability to view transaction history and request documents on the account. Everett had not mentioned this to me. I thought about all the times over the past year Lorraine had asked about paperwork, about whether I had an accountant, about whether everything was in order after Beverly passed. She'd framed it as concern. She'd made it sound like she was just trying to help. Milton set a fourth document on the table. This one was from the bank's fraud division. 6 weeks ago, the bank had identified a credit card application submitted in my name. The card had been opened with a $12,000 limit. I had not applied for it. The signature on the application was close to mine, but not exact. The bank had flagged it and frozen the account pending investigation, but had not yet contacted me directly because the investigation was still open. I looked at that document for a long time. Beverly had suspected this kind of thing was possible. That's why she'd kept notes. That's why she'd called Milton when she was still well enough to make the trip to his office. That's why she'd put that USB in the garage under the shelf she knew I'd run my hand along eventually. She saw it. She couldn't stop it from starting, but she made sure I'd have everything I needed when it did. Milton said, Beverly's exact words to me in our last meeting were, they are not planning for Roland's future. They are planning around it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked him what my options were. He said I had several. The fraudulent credit card application was a clear case for the bank's fraud division and potentially for law enforcement. The unauthorized address change could be challenged and reversed immediately. The limited access authorization Everett had signed could be legally contested, and the trust Beverly had established was completely untouchable. No joint account, no family claim, no legal argument Lorraine or anyone else could make would get near it. I asked him if there was a lawyer he trusted. He said yes, and that Beverly had already asked him that same question. I drove home in the dark that evening. Cold night, clear sky. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Beverly had been gone 8 months. She'd been sick before that. And somewhere in those last difficult months in between the doctor appointments and the medication schedules, and the days when getting out of bed took everything she had, she had sat down with Milton Pressler and built me a safety net, not because she was afraid, because she was paying attention. I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and called Virgil Crane. Virgil Crane had been my closest friend for over 30 years. We'd worked together at the same shop for most of that time before we both retired. He was the kind of man who showed up when you needed him and didn't ask too many questions until you were ready to answer them. He came over the next morning at 7 with a thermos of coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table. I told him everything. He listened the whole way through without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So what do you want to do about it?" I told him I wasn't going to yell at anyone. I wasn't going to show up at Lorraine's door. I wasn't going to give Everett an ultimatum over the phone. I was going to do this the right way, quietly and completely. And when it was done, there would be nothing left to argue about. Virgil nodded and said he knew a lawyer. A good one. He'd used him years ago during a dispute over his late brother's property, and the man had been thorough and straightforward. We called him that same afternoon. Over the next 2 weeks, we built the case. Milton pulled the complete financial records going back 5 years. The bank's fraud division officially documented the credit card application and confirmed the signature was not a match to mine on file. Beverly's notes from the USB were organized and printed in chronological order. The unauthorized address change was documented and reversed. The limited access form Everett had signed was flagged for legal review. The lawyer sent a formal letter to Everett and Lorraine, notifying them that I was now represented by counsel and that any further attempt to access, modify, or redirect any account or asset in my name would result in immediate legal action. I did not call Everett. I did not send any message. I said nothing. That was the hardest part. Not the paperwork, not the meetings, not even reading Beverly's notes a second time to get them organized. The hardest part was staying quiet while I waited. Everett showed up at my house 4 days after we sent the letter. I pulled into the driveway after a hardware run and his car was parked across the street with the engine still running. He was on my porch before I reached the steps. He didn't smile. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and he looked like a man trying to hold himself together. He said we needed to talk. I unlocked the door and held it open but didn't step aside to let him in. He stood on the porch. He said Christmas had been handled badly and he knew that. Said Lorraine thought it would be easier on everyone to spend the holiday with her family and things had moved fast and he hadn't communicated well. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the porch boards when he said it. I told him he could have called. He said he knew, said it was on him. Then he shifted and said he actually wanted to ask me about something, about some of the financial paperwork Beverly had left behind. Said he and Lorraine had been going through some documents and thought it might help me to have someone assist with organizing things. Said he just wanted to make sure everything was in order so I didn't have to handle it alone. I looked at him standing on my porch. He had Beverly's eyes. Same color, same shape, but the expression on his face right now wasn't anything I recognized from her. I asked him whether he knew Lorraine had changed the mailing address on our joint checking account. He went still. I asked him whether he knew about the credit card application submitted in my name that he hadn't signed and I hadn't signed. He looked away toward the yard. That was enough of an answer. I told him straight. I said, you didn't come here to check on me. You came to find out what I know and what I still have access to. He started to say something. I kept going. I told him I knew about the address change. I knew about the access form he'd signed. I knew about the credit card. I knew about every conversation Lorraine had steered toward money in the past 2 years. I knew about the time she went through papers in my study while Beverly was in the kitchen. Beverly kept notes. Beverly kept very good notes. Everett stood there and didn't say anything. I told him I had a lawyer and that a letter had already been sent. I told him the trust Beverly had set up was in my name only, and there was no legal path to it from any direction. I told him that if the credit card fraud was pursued through the bank's process, it would become a matter for law enforcement and not just civil court. He looked like a man standing on ground that had just shifted under him. I asked him if Lorraine was in the car. He said she was. I told him to go home. I told him to tell Lorraine I said hello. He stood there one more moment, opened his mouth like he was going to push back and then thought better of it. He walked down the steps and back to the car without another word. I watched Lorraine lean over to say something to him when he got in. The car backed out slowly and drove off down the street. I closed the door. The house was warm. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a while looking at Beverly's recipe book sitting open where I'd left it. She had seen this coming before either of them made a single move. About 2 weeks after Everett showed up on my porch, Lorraine made her next move. She called it a family meeting. She sent a message to Everett and CC'd me on it, framing the whole thing as a chance to clear the air and get on the same page about Beverly's estate. She suggested my house. She suggested a Sunday afternoon. She said she thought it would be good for everyone to sit down together and talk things through calmly. I replied and said Sunday worked fine. What Lorraine didn't know was that I had already spoken to the lawyer about exactly this kind of meeting. We had expected it. Milton had expected it too. The offer to meet at my house was the tell. She wanted to be on familiar ground with documents ready to sign. When Sunday came, I set the kitchen table with 4 chairs. Milton was already there when Everett and Lorraine arrived. The lawyer came in right behind them. Lorraine stopped in the doorway when she saw them. She recovered fast. She smiled and said she hadn't realized I'd invited anyone else. She said she thought this was going to be a family conversation. I told her it was. I said these were people who were looking out for my interests, the same way family should. We all sat down. The lawyer laid out the documents one at a time. The address change on the joint account and the date it was made, the limited access form Everett had signed and what it authorized, the fraudulent credit card application with the mismatched signature flagged by the bank's fraud division, Beverly's notes printed in order, 14 months of careful observations with dates and details. Lorraine looked at each document as it was placed in front of her. Her expression stayed controlled. She said some of it was a misunderstanding. She said the address change had been a mistake. She said the credit card thing was something she knew nothing about. The lawyer told her the bank's fraud division had already been notified and that their investigation was ongoing. He told her the address change had been documented and reversed, and that the timeline of when it was made was part of the record. He told her that the limited access form Everett had signed was being reviewed, and that any further attempts to access or redirect assets in my name would move the matter from civil to criminal court. Lorraine didn't say anything after that. Everett sat across from me through all of it and didn't look up for a long time. When he finally did, he looked like a man trying to figure out the exact moment he had made a wrong turn. He looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know what. After Milton and the lawyer left, I sat at the table with Everett for a few minutes, just the two of us. Lorraine had gone to wait in the car. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood how far things had gone until he saw it laid out on the table. He said Lorraine had framed everything as just being practical, just planning ahead, just trying to help an older man who was grieving and might need support managing his affairs. I told him I understood how that kind of thing happens. I told him Beverly had seen it before I did and before he did, and that she'd made sure I'd be standing on solid ground when it mattered. The wedding was postponed not long after that. That was Everett's decision. We didn't talk about it much. He called me a few weeks later and we had a conversation that didn't fix everything but was a start. He sounded more like himself than he had in a couple of years. 1 year later, same house, same porch, same December cold. Virgil is in the kitchen right now, arguing with my neighbor Harriet about whether cornbread needs sugar in it. I can hear them from out here on the porch. Beverly had an opinion on that subject and I know exactly what she would have said. I invited people this year who actually showed up. Virgil, Harriet from down the road, a young couple from the neighborhood who had a hard year, a few guys from the old shop who I'd lost touch with and reached back out to. When I told them I was doing Christmas dinner, they said they'd be there and they meant it. The table was full tonight, loud and warm, and a little chaotic. Someone knocked over a glass. Virgil burned the first batch of rolls and didn't tell anyone until after we'd already eaten them. Beverly's pot roast recipe turned out right. I'm sitting in my porch chair now with a cup of coffee. Cold air, clear sky, light coming through the window behind me from a full room. Last year I set a table for 2 people who never planned to come. This year I stopped waiting on them, and the table I built instead is a better one. Beverly saw all of this before I did. She didn't make a scene about it. She didn't warn me out loud. She just quietly built me a way through it and trusted me to find it when I needed to. That is who she was. So let me ask you something directly. If the people closest to you started making plans around you instead of for you, would you even know the signs? Would you have someone in your corner who saw it coming? I got lucky. My wife paid attention when I wasn't. If that story hits close to home, hit subscribe. And if you've been through something like this yourself, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. You'd be surprised how many men your age are sitting on the same porch asking the same questions.